Hello, everyone. Parul Srivastava here from the 1947 Partition Archive. Welcome to the third season of Sunday Stories Live, brought to you by 1947 Partition Archive, a global non-profit, non-governmental organization that works tirelessly to preserve the nearly lost oral histories of partition. I'm excited to be hosting this season. As I said, this is the third season of Sunday Stories. The first season was hosted by Noor Anand Chawla. The second one was hosted by Sonam Kalra, and I'll be your MC for the event today. It's my pleasure to welcome you today to this episode where we will be conversing with a well-known historian, Dr. Amber Abbas. Her research focuses on the period of transition associated with the 1947 partition of India and the independence and its particular impact on South Asian Muslims. As the name suggests, this event series will be taking place every Sunday, so be sure to join us. If you wish to watch any episode from the last two seasons, they are available on our Facebook and YouTube page under the video section. Sunday Stories is a series that will bring to you academics, scholars, oral historians, journalists, and people's personal stories of partition. This season's theme is Understanding Partition Through Memory Studies, which is an academic field studying the use of memory as a tool for remembering the past. So let me just start by telling you a little bit about our guest for today, Amber Abbas. Dr. Amber Abbas is a well-known historian and an associate professor of history at St. Joseph's University in Philadelphia, where she teaches courses on world history, South Asia, South Asian America, and oral history methodology. She's the author of the recent book from IB Tauris called Partition's First Generation, Space, Place, and Identity in Muslim South Asia. She also contributes to and collaborates with the South Asian American Digital Archive and currently serves as president of its board of directors. So let's welcome her. You can all send, you can all send a like or a heart because, we can't really hear you clapping. So yeah. Hi, Dr. Abbas. How are you?
I'm well. I'm delighted to be here. Thank you so much. And thank you to Gunita and the 1947 Partition Archive for inviting me to be here today.
It's wonderful to have you. I mean, it's my absolute honor to be hosting you in today's episode, which is the first episode. So I think I'm going to jump right in. Okay, so I just want to ask you, why don't you tell us a bit about your heritage and share with your, audience what actually motivated you to study partition and write your book, Partition's First Generation, and what's your connection to Aligarh?
Well, my father was born in Aligarh. My whole family, my grandmother was born there, and they had a large family and a large home in the city of Aligarh. And my father came to the United States in 1960 and ended up meeting my mother here, who's white American, and they married. And so I actually grew up in the Middle East, which meant that we were quite close to our family. So we spent a lot of time in Pakistan. My father's family migrated in October of 1947, from Aligarh to Pakistan. And so I spent my whole childhood visiting on holiday and had the privilege of getting to know and spend time with my family. I have a large family and lots of cousins, but I didn't grow up speaking Urdu, and that in a way separated me from some of the intimacy of living in a multi-generational household. Even if we were only there for a couple of weeks at a time, there would be my grandmother and my aunts and uncles and my great aunts and great uncles, and we would see them quite frequently, but I was never privy to the casual conversation or the transmission of family history, because even though most of the family is fluent in English, that kind of storytelling would often happen in Urdu. And as a child, I certainly didn't have access to it. And I started to feel that sense of loss as I got older, that I was missing something in my connection to my family in Pakistan. And so I set about learning Urdu. That became my goal. And I started studying when I was an undergraduate at Duke University and studied both Hindi and Urdu. I studied abroad in India, in Jodhpur in Rajasthan, and studied Hindi there. And then when I began my graduate study, I continued my language study at the University of Texas Texas at Austin, and went on to study Urdu also with the American Institute of Indian Studies program in Lucknow. So before I moved to Aligarh to start my dissertation research, I had spent a lot of time in and around the subcontinent, in and around my family's home, had finally been able to speak to my grandmother and actually interview her very briefly. She was very nervous about the microphone, so it's a very short interview. But for me, that was the real fulfillment of my life's goal, to develop this connection to my family. It was when I was in Pakistan in 1999. I had just finished my undergraduate degree from Duke, and I had a Fulbright, as you do. A wonderful program. I had a Fulbright to live and study in Pakistan, and I was doing a project that was completely unrelated to partition. But I met another Fulbright scholar when I was there, Lucy Chester, who has written on the Border Award, the Radcliffe Award. She was doing her dissertation research, and I said, you might want to meet my great uncle because he served on the Punjab Boundary Force. And she said, oh, yes, I would. Wow. And I said, well, I'll be happy to introduce you, but I would like to sit in the interview and listen. And she allowed me to do that. And that was really the first time that I heard my own family's story. My great uncle, Major General Wajahat Hussain, who ended up being a major informant on my book. And he told the story about being educated in Aligarh all the way through his education before joining the British military during the Second World War, and then ultimately opting for Pakistan. So that was my connection to the place, not just the city of Aligarh as the place of my family's heritage, but also the university as a site where many of the elders in our family had been educated.
So, Amber, your father also went to Aligarh Muslim University?
He didn't. He was only 5 years old in 1947. And so his story of partition, which I collected later, after I had done all my interviews in South Asia, I came back to the US, and in 2011, I interviewed my dad about his life story. And he retold a story that I had known from my childhood, which was a story of his having been injured in the course of migrating, that he was in the back of a truck, and as the truck bounced down the road, he cut his leg on a piece of metal that was jutting out. And I think because of that injury, some of those memories were really cemented in his mind. And he was a very young child, so he has sort of snapshots and impressions of that journey, some of which I tell in the book, and other parts of which are available in the interview I've done with him that's archived at SADA, at the South Asian American Digital Archive, which is sada.org. The full interview I've done with him is available there.
Okay, oh, that's awesome. Okay, so Amar, what was your, sort of method of collecting oral history back in 2005 in the Indian subcontinent? Because I think you interviewed people in all the three countries, right? In India, Pakistan, and Bangladesh. So yeah. I would also love to sort of hear more about your philosophy on oral history as a resource, in understanding history, because it's a very contested field, we all know, because history is heavily dependent upon archives. So what's your view about that, and how did you sort of use the findings in your book, in your work?
Yeah, so I earned my PhD in the history department at the University of Texas at Austin, and I was exceedingly lucky to work with Dr. Gail Minot, who is a professor of South Asian history and particularly women's history. And scholars of women's history have really pioneered the method of tracking down voices that are otherwise not found in archives, because women and Muslim women who often lived in enclosed spaces within the home in the subcontinent may have been educated, as her work shows, and may have been literate, both for Muslim women in reading Arabic, but also in speaking and reading Hindi or Urdu. But their production, the work that they created, the conversations they had, didn't make it out into the public sphere to be collected and archived. And that creates an uneven impression about how history is formed and what matters in history. And so while Dr. Minot is not an oral historian herself, she has a sensibility about what it means to gather historical stories and create sources from sites other than material archives. And I was trained by an oral historian at the University of Texas very early in my graduate work. I knew I wanted to do oral histories, and I had the privilege of studying with Martha Narkunis, who's a sort of an elder in the oral history community in the United States, and who has done very, very sensitive interviews and cares a lot about the ethics of our practice, the ethics of our craft, and how we build relationships before we speak with narrators. And so I was trained in that tradition. For me, oral history is not an alternative methodology of historical inquiry. It's what I do, because as the 1947 Partition Archive has helped to sort of spread the word about, these stories were very much in danger of being lost. You know, in the aftermath of the partition and independence, in the 1950s, there was a lot of focus on state building and rehabilitation, but the earliest production that Indians and South Asians were doing to document their own stories was fiction. And so those stories, those short stories, and sort of remembered fiction, really were the first time we got to hear the voices of Indians, Pakistanis, East Pakistanis, and Bangladeshis about their own experiences, rather than receiving the quote unquote official history through the lens of, you know, state documents or imperial documents, or even the memories of British civil servants who lived through those events. And you know, with the work of Urvashi Butalia and Menon and Basine in the 1990s, we first got a glimpse into how South Asians would tell their own stories, and particularly how women would tell their own stories of partition. And one of the things that became clear to me the first time I read The Other Side of Silence, which is an incredible starting point in the scholarship, was the back and forth. You know, she was able to move across the border between India and Pakistan in a way that not all scholars can, particularly scholars who are based in the subcontinent. And as I began to think about my own work, it became really important for me to not have a focus on a single country, but to recognize the ways in which communities had spread from regional centers, cities, towns, neighborhoods, communities, into new neighborhoods, towns, and communities, and what that might mean for people. And that the only way to get at that was to ask questions and to listen.
Yeah. Okay. So for those of you who are just joining, you're watching Sunday Stories live from the 1947 Partition Archive. This is season 3, and Dr. Amber Abbas is our first guest here. My name is Parul Srivastava. So we'll move on to the next question. I was thinking if you could also just tell us something about, did something stood out for you in your journey as an oral historian in the subcontinent, something which you did not know before doing your field work in the subcontinent? So if you could share something.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that I came into the study of partition, as many scholars have done, thinking that I would hear stories of the Punjab. As Gyan Pandey has argued, the violence that was partition, that I understood partition to be an episode of catastrophic violence that distinguished the partition from independence, right? We could talk about independence. The reason we talk about partition is because of the violence that took place. And I can remember doing some interviews and being deeply disappointed when the people I spoke with didn't tell those kinds of stories. And I thought that I had failed. And I remember expressing that to a friend of mine, and she said, well, has anyone else heard the stories that they told you? And I said, no. And she said, well, then tell us what they say. And I thought that piece of advice has stayed with me for so long because we don't define people's stories for them.
True.
Narrators tell the stories that they have to tell. And I think oral history as a historical practice must recognize the flaws, the habits of memory, the ways in which memory is recuperative. It does its own work for restoring our reputations, for memory slips into consistency where we want to tell consistent stories about ourselves. And so it is imperfect, but it doesn't exist in isolation. And that's something that in the, whatever tensions or controversies may exist around oral history as a reasonable method of historical inquiry, I think that it's really important to remember that it doesn't exist alone. We don't take oral histories at face value in the same way that we wouldn't take documentary history at face value. As scholars and researchers, we bring them into conversation with other things that we know. And something that made a deep impression on me has been the notion that that the oral history is both the interview and the product, right? So it's both the interaction and it's the transcript or the final oral document. It is in that sense both what some scholars have called cumulative and presentist. It exists in the moment in which it's created, but it also represents the accumulation of historical experience. So it's less about fact, and it's not necessarily good for reconstructing events, than it is about meaning. What people do with the way that they understand facts and they understand their own history. And I think the ethics of our practice require us to keep that in mind, to honor the story and also to honor and seek out what else we can know about the context, that we can build the pieces together. But I think that what didn't answer your question, because you asked about sort of a specific moment, but the wonderful thing about the work that I had the chance to do was the opportunity to meet so many generous storytellers, that I would often show up with almost no introduction. I cold called people. I had a lot of help from the alumni Old Boys networks, the Aligarh Old Boys networks in the United States and India and Pakistan and Bangladesh. They worked to connect me with the elders of the Aligarh community and the folks who had been there at the time of the 1940s and 1950s. Without their support, I couldn't have done anything, because oral history is about relationships. And the Old Boys Association helped me to build those relationships and supported my work in building those relationships. But then at the point of interaction, I was invited in for tea. I would sit, most of the interviews, you can hear people chewing and slurping tea, because that's what we did while we talked. And it was important to create that kind of that comfort of conversation, so that they could have a safe space in which to share their stories. And that meant an enormous amount to me. I often felt that I was being received as a member of a family. And it didn't hurt that I had connections to Aligarh and to the Aligarh community. So whether I was in Aligarh itself, or whether I was in Pakistan or Bangladesh interviewing old boys or old girls of the university, in some cases, graduates of the women's college, I often was welcomed sort of as a granddaughter of the family. And that was a very special experience.
Yeah, I think I completely relate with you on this, because having done some oral history work back in India, I think sometimes what happens is that I don't really remember the interview per se, but I remember how the interviewee and their family made me feel when, like I was there. So yeah, I mean, that's another, okay, so from what I understood, so in your book, I think you seem to be sort of tracking the students who, are rooted in the ethos of AMU from the British rule to their respective places in independent India. And, I mean, what I want to know is that Aligarh is not a border area, right?
Yeah.
So how and why did you choose this city to record stories? And were you also able to explore cities around Aligarh?
Yes. So this is a really crucial aspect of the work, and my findings in the book is that Aligarh is not a border area, but Aligarh was partitioned, and that has to do with the culture of the university, and the way that the university, as a Muslim majority space, functions within a non-Muslim majority city.
Yeah.
Um, and I chose Aligarh because I initially, in that first time I heard my great uncle speak. He spoke about Aligarh, and it became clear that it was such an important part of his sense of himself to have been associated with Aligarh. And then later, because I came to understand the history of the university, my supervisor, Professor Minot, of course, has worked on the women's college. Once I started to understand it, I started to see, oh, my family's experience, which feels so singular and important to me, is part of this much
Yeah.
larger experience that was intimately connected to the politics of Muslim nationalism and the freedom movement. For whether the goals of the students when they were advocating for Pakistan and joining the Muslim League, whether their goal was independent statehood, I think is less clear.
Mm-hmm.
So what has been important is to, sorry, I don't know if you can hear the fire trucks zooming by, but it's important for me to listen to the stories that they told about their own experiences and to take them seriously, to understand that what they were seeking was a kind of Muslim solidarity, which was exactly the way that they had been taught to think and understand their place in South Asian society when they were at Aligarh. There's a very deep strain of a politics of solidarity at the university. And so within the university, there were a wide variety of political perspectives. And that's one of the things that's very special about that space and that I discovered in my interviews was how much diversity there was there. And while it doesn't seem an obvious site of partition, what my book does and what my research showed is that even in sites quite distant from the border, people experienced extreme disruption to their sense of place. And place is not just about location, it's about meaning. Aligarh was a location that was deeply imbued with meaning for Indian Muslims, particularly for Indian Muslims of the elite classes.
Yeah.
But it had resonance and repercussions for Muslims throughout the country before 47 and then of course after. So one of the things that my book does is it sort of restores Muslim voices to the history of partition, which especially when I started my work were largely absent in the scholarship, and that has changed, which is wonderful. But also to work on a site that's distant from the border and a site that was not a site of catastrophic violence. So not only is it far, but there was no violence in Aligarh University in 1947. So can we think about it as a site of partition? Well, partition, violence makes it into the archive, and the absence of violence doesn't. So how can we tell partition stories in places that were not disrupted by violence and are far from the obvious sites of partition? We have to speak to people about what happened within their communities and what it meant to them. Aligarh is unique in the sense that it remains in India, but it is so crucial to the history of the creation of Pakistan.
Yeah.
And it drew in students from East Bengal, Muslims from East Bengal, who then went on to settle in Bangladesh, or East Pakistan and then Bangladesh. And the institution continues to unite all those groups because of its importance for Muslims broadly. And in that sense, it helps to create these threads of continuity across the borders that broke apart individual locations. So the meaning of that place is really central. And the meaning of that place changed intensely in 1947 as the sort of familiar spaces and places of the university became strange and sometimes threatening. And if I can I just read you like one little quotation from an interview? I know we're
Yeah.
getting to the end. But one of the chapters in my book, so one of the things I do in my book is to try to reframe partition as a singular experience to thinking more of a process of partitioning
Yeah.
that took place over a long period of time, and in many communities is continuing to be reenacted as Muslims, especially throughout the subcontinent, continue to try to find ways of belonging. And that's true in India, Pakistan, and in Bangladesh, irrespective, I mean, in different ways, but irrespective of majority or minority, that the politics remain really unsettled.
Yeah.
So I opened the chapter in the book on which I call Partitioning and Aligarh Muslim University with a quotation from the Prime Minister, from Nehru in 1948, who gave the convocation speech on January 24th, 1948. And if you know your history, you'll know that that was only a few days before the assassination of Gandhi.
Yeah.
Right? So Nehru says in the address, "I often wonder how the young feel, who at the threshold of their lives have seen and experienced catastrophe and disaster. They will no doubt survive it, for youth is resilient, but it may well be that they will carry the mark of it for the rest of their days." And that, I think, is so important. When I spoke to the former students of Aligarh, what they told me was that in 1947, and this is a quotation from Ahmed Saeed, who's actually Lucknowi, and I met him in Lucknow in 2009. He said, in 1947, these communal riots were all around us. We used to read it in the newspapers. Naturally, we were scared, and we were in the center of it. All around, there were people belonging to the other community, so we were scared, and there were threats also. At least we felt so. I don't know how real they were. So naturally, there were threats.
Yeah.
And hopefully what you can hear there is the sense that while we may think of Aligarh as being far away from the politics of partition because it's far away from national borders, for the students there, it was absolutely central to their partition experience. And the place that partition was happening was on the boundary between the university and the city outside. And that was the border that they needed to protect. And that was the border that would keep them safe inside and where they feared that they would be unsafe outside.
Yeah.
And so I think of Aligarh as a center of partition history, even though it's distant from Punjab, it's distant from Bengal, it's distant from Delhi, which are the standard sort of sites of partition that we've looked at now. And the wonderful thing about studying partition and its history is that the field continues to grow. In part because of the work that the 1947 Partition Archive is doing, and because of the work individual scholars are doing to try to gather these stories while we still can.
Yeah. I mean, this is so interesting. I think you can call it the story of, like the lived history of AMU that way, because it was a Muslim majority area, surrounded by non-Muslim, majority areas. So yeah, okay. So I would just like to tell our audience to, keep posting your questions in the comment section because the Q&A session is coming up soon. I think I have one final question for you, Dr. Amber. So having done oral history fieldwork, I know how our class, our gender, sometimes even our caste in India can affect the kind of, access that we might get into people's life when we are, going to talk about something as sensitive as the partition. And so I want to ask you, did you face any kind of difficulty while recording oral narratives because of your gender or your nationality? And how did your experience vary, like if at all, in Bangladesh, India, and Pakistan?
It definitely did. I mean, in Pakistan, I had the advantage of having a family that I could stay with, that I came home to at the end of each and every day. My young cousins were eager to hear, what did you learn today? What did they tell you? I was amazed at how excited they were to hear these stories. Maybe because by the time of their generation, the family had stopped telling them as much. And so I had the advantage of my uncle connecting me to people there. And in India, I was alone. I arrived and I didn't know anybody. I had my teachers in Lucknow that I had met in 2008, and they had helped to connect me with a history professor at AMU, Professor Gulfishan Khan. who had introduced me to a couple of people in the summer of 2008. But I was quite often just showing up places and asking people to talk to me. I had almost no credibility. When I did come back in 2009, Professor Shirin Musvi, also in the AMU history department, helped me again to make those connections. And the history department at AMU was kind of a home for me. I spent time there almost every day during my stay. The archivists at the library in AMU and in the Maulana Azad Library were amazing. But I had no connections, and in India, in some ways, I tried to mask my connection to Pakistan. So people would ask me why I was there, and as you did when we started, what's your connection to this place? Why are you here? And I would say, well, my father was born in Aligarh, and they would say, well, where is he now? Who is he? And I knew no one would know him because he was a child when he left. So I would say, he's outside. And I tried to be as vague as I could because I didn't want people to see my presence as a distraction or as controversial. And then as we built that relationship, as we had bigger conversation, I can remember, for instance, sitting on the veranda at Habib Manzil speaking to Riazur Rahman Sherwani, and I had interviewed him for an hour or so, and then he just stopped and he said, who are you? Tell me more about who you are. And then and if someone asked, I would tell them my whole story and my connection. In Bangladesh as well, I was apprehensive about speaking to people about my connections to Pakistan. But it turned out that many of the people that I interviewed, they were Bengali, they were or Sylheti, they had studied in Aligarh, but they had also chosen Pakistan. And even with the pain and the horrors of 1971 and what it meant for them and their families to have participated in and gone through that civil war, they still had fond memories of Pakistan and their experiences there. And many of them would tell me about their travels in West Pakistan and the beauty of the landscape. And so my connections to Aligarh helped me to build connections across all those boundaries. And I consider myself extraordinarily lucky to have been able to move across the national boundaries with some ease because of my citizenship. Because although there are ways in which I belong to Pakistan, there are ways in which I belong to Aligarh, but my documentation says that I'm an American, and that gave me a freedom of movement that I understand that many scholars don't have, even as a woman. And even at the time, I'm a young woman. But as I say, I was so often welcomed as a member of the community and really a member of the family. And that meant a lot to me. And I hope that it's reflected in the way that I tell the stories, that the stories don't belong to me. I'm retelling them, I'm bringing them to readers through the lens of my analysis. But my goal always was to be honest and to honor this very complex history. One of my favorite phrases, and I'll close on this, is Professor David Gilmartin has written about the multiple realities of partition experience. And for me, that concept was really at the center of my inquiry, was to recognize that the disappointment I felt at the beginning of my work, that I wasn't hearing stories of, Punjabi partition violence, that meant that I had failed. Once I reframed my expectations to say, partitioning is an experience that is composed of multiple realities. And if I am listening well, then I can tell you what they say.
Okay, so thank you so much, Dr. Abbas, for sharing with us, your wonderful research, your insights, and yeah, I mean, like people like you with such plethora of knowledge on partition, like you agreed to grace our Sunday Stories episode. So thank you so much for that. I think we are ready to take some questions from the audience now. Yeah. Okay. So in the meantime, okay, great. So we have. So Bindas Gang, okay, great. They ask you, where were you based during your research at AMU, or how long did the project take to complete? Okay.
Well, the Bindas Gang knows very well where I was based because they took me in as an orphan in Gurgaon. So I was living, when I arrived first in AMU, I arrived in late February, and I didn't know Seoul. And through some expatriate friends living in Delhi, I was connected with a family in Aligarh itself who helped me to find a hostel. And I lived in a girls' hostel. Most of the other women in the hostel were high school students seeking admission into the AMU. But I have a group of international friends, some based in Pakistan, that I got to know during my 1999 Fulbright there, who are connected to the Bindas gang in Delhi and Gurgaon. And when the call went from Pakistan to Gurgaon, they said, our friend is there and she needs a family. They took me in, they welcomed me. I lived on all of my holidays, many weekends in Delhi with the gang that became my gang. I spent, all told, I was in India in 2009 for 10 months, but I spent about 15 or 16 months in the field doing research in India, Pakistan, and Bangladesh from 2005 until 2010. So it was a long duration for the entire project, which allowed me, again, to move across those borders with the support of the American Institute of Bangladesh Studies, American Institute of Indian Studies, the Fulbright program. I had a lot of support, both personally and professionally, but I couldn't have done it without my gang.
Thank you so much, Dr. Abbas. Okay, so Ahmed Dost wants to say that special regards to both of you respected madams. Thank you so much. Yeah. Malkeet Singh Ghuman says, wonderful conversation. Thank you to the Partition Archive. Thank you so much, Malkeet ji, for tuning in. Okay, so Hamad Ul Hassan wants to know that can they find you on Facebook?
My professional social media is really more through Twitter. So I'm AHA South Asia on Twitter, and that's a good place to find me, where I have sort of a professional space.
Wonderful, wonderful. Asad Faisal Faruqi says, interesting and enlightening interaction. Thank you so much, Asad, for tuning into our episode.
Yeah, thank you. It's nice to see folks with connections to Aligarh.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Oh, Shikha Zaman wishes you all the very best.
Shukriya.
Shazia Rafi asks, are you still able to get academic visas to India?
That's a good question. I haven't tried. I had some difficulties securing a visa in 2009. I had to personally appear at the consulate and speak with the consul, the Indian consul in the United States, about my research. And he was a Punjabi, and he felt very acutely the painful history that his family had experienced, and he wanted to know why I had framed my project in the way that I had. And in the end, the wonderful thing about our conversation was that finally I said, look, you're a Punjabi, I'm a Punjabi. You know very well that being in India in February is the best time to be there. The weather is perfect. And please make sure that I can get my academic visa so that I can get there to enjoy the very best that North India has to offer. And I think that personal connection meant a lot. Again, so much of the work that we do is about relationships, and we should never, ever forget that. Because none of us scholars, whether oral historians or archival scholars, none of us work in isolation. We're always among community, and can't do our work without help.
Yeah. So, I mean, I would just like to pitch in my perspective, because I am from Lucknow and my PhD is happening at the University of Hyderabad. So I did interview as, both the places. So again, in Hyderabad, I knew nobody. And then somehow I contacted somebody through the archive who happened to give me an entire list of people to interview. So it had, around 15 odd names. And, like that's how, just by giving the reference of that one, gentleman, I'm like, this is making my job so easy. So, yeah.
Well, and your research too then is taking place in a site of partition far from the border. I mean, absolutely. Hyderabad and Aligarh had intimate connections because the chancellor of Osmania University was, one of the landed elite from Aligarh. And so those connections during the 1930s and 40s were very, very close.
I know, yeah. Correct. So we have another question here from Vishram G. Nayak. He asks, would you like to comment on the possibility of a European Union-like entity with sunset clauses being given a try for the partition countries? What do you think?
Well, in moments like this, I always remind people I'm a historian and not a political scientist. But I did hear particularly from people I interviewed in Bangladesh, that they were the ones who felt that something like this would make sense. And even in Pakistan, I heard people say, England and France fought for 100 years. If they could do it, we could do it. And I think that I would love to stay optimistic about the rekindling of closeness between governments that represent people who share so much. And there is a deep tragedy in how difficult it is for people to cross the border, to go back and visit their ancestral homelands on all sides of the borders drawn in 47 and 71. I was the first person in my family to visit our ancestral home. And in a sense, I'm also the most distant, but my father couldn't visit it. My cousins can't visit it. And that's heartbreaking. It meant a lot to my family to be able to come back and show them pictures. And the story I tell in my book is when I finally did find our ancestral home, which took some effort, the family who lived there, who has a brass and tin pots business, they were unwilling to speak with me because they had received the home as refugee property, and they had strong feelings about their experience fleeing Lahore. But they told me the house had been partitioned 20 years prior, and there was a family who was living in one half of the house, one half of what had been this large home, and that family were not partition refugees and didn't have such strong feelings. They said, why don't you go and talk to them? And they invited me in. They took me on a tour of the house. I stood on the roof and watched the sunset as my grandmother would have seen it. And they sent me home with besan ka laddu. And they said, take this to your family in Pakistan. And for me, that moment was so telling about how much we share. And I would love to see a future in which we can enact that closeness again, as I really was able to do by moving across the borders, but it was an unusual privilege.
Yeah. I understand. I mean, it has a lot to do with, like your passport, because people within the subcontinent cannot really, go very easily from one country to another. So, yeah. Okay, so Rashina Humayu says, thank you so much, Dr. Abbas, for preserving the stories of so many. I have special ties to AMU and the Women's College. Would you share a story you heard from some of the women you spoke with? That's an interesting question. Yeah.
Yeah, that's a wonderful question. Yeah. I interviewed twice Fatma Farid Rahman. They're sort of three sisters, and I met them in Lahore. But Fatma Farid Rahman was a real leader among the Aligarh community in Pakistan, and she and her sisters told the stories of being transported in palanquins from their home. They actually lived in Aligarh city, and so they didn't live in halls, but they would travel by a covered palanquin to get to the campus. And they spoke about a lot of women. One of the parts that was very important and meaningful for a lot of the women was sports. So they talk about playing sports within the boundaries of the women's college, badminton, and that surprised me to hear that part of their story, having otherwise not been very familiar with the culture there. And then also they talked about the idea that their migration was not always their choice. So we have a tendency to think about partition as forced migrations. In Aligarh, it was generally not the case because of the absence of violence and because of the privilege that Aligarh students had within the context of Muslim South Asia. They were highly educated. They often came from landed or wealthy families, sometimes with ties to the civil service or
Mm-hmm.
other sort of elite roles. And that meant that they could opt. So my family, my uncles, they opted for Pakistan. It was a choice to go there. And women tell stories about, say, being married to men who had opted for Pakistan. So they remained in India. The Minhaj sisters remained in India and until such time as their marriages were arranged in Pakistan. And one of my favorite interviews was I interviewed one of the elders of the community around several of the elders actually around the women's college, and I'm sorry, I'm just looking up Saida Kidwai, who everybody just refers to as Saida Appa, who took a degree in geography from Aligarh University in 1938. She claims to have been the first woman to have been in classes with the male students, and she talked about sitting behind a partition in the classroom. The cover of my book, actually,
Yeah.
woo, where it is, shows women coming in full parda into the classroom at the men's college, but you can also see in the back that they actually would sit behind the chicks to get their education. And so there are some funny stories that both men and women told about those interactions and the eagerness that the young men and women had to meet each other, even though there were so many restrictions around meeting each other. And it helped me to see the sort of mischievous side of the student community there, where so much of my work focused on these very serious issues. But it's impossible to forget that we were talking about young men and women living away from home, and the residential university was a fairly novel development in India, in Aligarh, and so provided all kinds of opportunities for mischief.
Oh, yeah. Oh, great. We have another question from Balbir Singh Khattar. Why do you think Punjab was affected with violence, but not Aligarh? Was that because of the academic atmosphere, maybe in the university, but surely it was not around?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
That's a good question, the sort of why question.
Yeah.
Because there were fairly stark boundaries between the university and the town. My research shows that there were some episodes of violence, but actually they were not, as some of the students feared, a result of outsiders coming into the university. They were often a result of students being mischievous and causing harm in the surrounding community. So the frictions that, and I write about this in the book, there was an episode in 1946 when the grain market of Aligarh was burned in a riot, and the riot was instigated by an altercation between some Aligarh students and a shopkeeper that then blew up around the heightened tensions in 1946. That then, I argue in the book, that episode sort of was the beginning of partitioning for the students in the university, because that was the first time that they started to talk about tensions between the university and the surrounding city. And the state government and the regional and city authorities actually sent a military force to, a police force to enforce that boundary between the university and the city. And that helped to preserve the peace there. And many of the students talk about remembering that presence.
Okay. Maike Daya, she asks, I would love to hear Professor Abbas's reflections on what kind of work needs to be done on partition going forward. Where does this conversation or research need to go? What remains, or what is she working on right now? Yeah, we all want to know what are you working on right now.
Well, I have to admit my new project is not a partition project. It's not even an Aligarh project. But I'll answer the question first, which is about where we need to go. And I think the emphasis, for instance, at the 1947 Partition Archive in the last decade has been on collection. And collecting the stories of partition is incredibly important and time-sensitive work. I felt that very very clearly in my own research, because many of the people I've interviewed have since died. And the opportunity to have collected their story, it will never arise again, and so that time sensitivity means that we have been working hard to collect, and now we may need to spend some time listening. Of course, our understanding of partition is always contingent upon the environment in which we live, and the conditions in South Asia as we approach the 75th anniversary of partition and independence are pretty troubled for people throughout the region, irrespective of their religious identities and backgrounds. And I think that, the previous question about how might we think to a more hopeful future, how can we use the work we've done on partition and the stories that we've heard to help create that hopeful future for people in the subcontinent? And also, how can we use our research here in the United States or in the UK, in the spaces where at least I live and work, to teach people here, whether of South Asian or not South Asian heritage, how India led the world in anti-colonialism, in sort of creating a 20th century world order that resisted the forces of the past, how that was created, and how the people that we've heard from in these oral histories were active participants in that. They were young people at the threshold of their careers. They grew up in a world that had no precedent in terms of developing the culture of nation states and independence. That we need to use those stories to teach about activism, about organizing, about social movements, and to use that to create more hopeful futures, I think, around the world.
Okay, Ahmed Dost says best wishes and good willings to both of you, respected madams. I think we got his. Yeah, thank you so much. Do we have any more questions? Oh yeah. So Farooq Khan says, thank you for a really enlightening conversation about an aspect of partition that is not widely discussed. Thank you so much, Farooq.
Professor Khan's work has been incredibly important in collecting stories of women in Punjab. And he's a social activist in his own community and has made a real impact. So it's an honor to have you here. Thank you.
Absolutely, absolutely. He's a wonderful person, yeah. So do we have, okay. Oh, okay. So Mike Daya says, thank you. Yes, more hopeful futures. Yes, I think we're all hoping for the same.
Yeah. And I think that's something that's so important to take away from this work, is that on all sides of the borders, people wanted peace. They continue to want a sense of belonging and safety. And that continues to be difficult for many people to secure. And we have to work to change that.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Amber. Do we have any more questions? If not, I'll just talk a bit about, the Partition Archive and how it documents the nearly lost history of partition. And our oral history flagship program is the largest of its kind in South Asia. And so far, with great dedication and grit, we have documented almost 10,000 stories in not just the Indian subcontinent, but across the globe. And you can learn more about our work by visiting our website or by speaking to any of our team members. So like the last 2 seasons, we have a brilliant lineup of speakers once again. So spread the word and do not forget to hop on with us every Sunday. We have one more comment by Balbir Singh Khattar. From what you say, this is more of a political problem then.
Well, I guess I'm not sure what this means in that, if you want to clarify for us. But I do think that when we talk about political problems, we should remember that governments are hired to represent their people, but governments have their own agendas, and people seek safety and community. And on all sides of the borders, that was what I found. People seeking connection. They desperately wanted to be connected to one another and to this shared history. And I hope that that's part of what the book does, is draws people in. As one of the folks who joined us today says, I have deep connections to Aligarh, and my hope is that through my research, I've helped people to connect to those experiences, to connect to that history, and to provide a space for thinking through the importance of the AMU, not only as like a site of Muslim nationalism in the early 20th century, which was so crucial to its sense of becoming, but also throughout the partitioning and the period of independence, when it has continued to be a site that brings Muslims from a number of different regions in the subcontinent and really the world, that brings them together. And that's the community there is incredibly diverse. It's international. It includes, men and women, and that it's a very, in that sense, a very special environment, not without its challenges, as any institution faces. And it will continue to grow and change, and to provide that sort of centering force for Indians, Muslim and otherwise.
Thank you so much, Amber. I think we have no more questions from the audience. So once again, I would like to thank you. Farooq Khan thanks us again. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Amber, for sort of, talking about AMU partition, oral history with such great nuance. Thank you so much. And
thank you, Parul, for your wonderful questions. It's such a pleasure to get to be here and to share my work. It's actually the first opportunity I've had to talk about the book, and it's a real pleasure. Thank you.
Yeah. My Kedaya also thanks the both of us for this illuminating conversation about shared histories and hopeful futures. Yes, thank you so much. And I would finally like to thank everybody else for tuning in, and please do return next week for yet another exciting conversation with our esteemed guest, historian and journalist Andrew Whitehead, where we'll try to understand Kashmir with the help of oral history. And if you love our oral history work and mission, please consider making a donation of any size. We rely 100% on donations as an NGO. In some countries, the donations are tax-free. Links are in the description to this video. Thank you so much. Thank you so much once again, Dr. Abbas. It was really nice, having this conversation with you here today.
It's my pleasure. Shukriya. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Yeah. Bye-bye. Good night to everybody else. Bye-bye.